Morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'll get started while we set up the PowerPoint. I want to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for hosting us here in Tunis today. I want to thank the organizing committee and a small army of people working behind the scenes, including the translators and the staff at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. This event has been at least 2 years in the making in terms of thinking about the purpose and the focus of this conference on economic and monetary sovereignty. We're here to think the theme, the quest for economic and monetary sovereignty. The implied concept here is that for most developing countries, post-colonial nations, we have political sovereignty. You rule over your territory, you have your president and prime minister and military and flag and everything, but never really achieved economic sovereignty and specifically monetary sovereignty. So this is really the underlying theme here, is that you can't really have political sovereignty and economic sovereignty without monetary sovereignty. And that's what led us to inviting a group of keynote speakers in different fields, not just in economics, but also participants from all over the continent and the rest of the world to be with us this week. I know the top of the thing is cut off, but I'm going to go ahead and get started just in case this is going to take a little bit longer. I'll just read the title just so you know what's on top. It's Reclaiming Monetary Sovereignty and Sustainable Prosperity. There is a display setting here. No, I'll just go like this and read it. The good news is that once we fix this, everybody else for the rest of the conference will have their slides working fine. Okay, so I want to start with a very basic definition of monetary sovereignty. So the line that's missing on top is, what is monetary sovereignty? And a monetarily sovereign government is a government that can issue its own currency, which any country can do, issue their own currency. In Tunis, we issue the Tunisian dinar. It's a government that collects taxes denominated in the national currency. Same thing in Tunisia, for example, we collect taxes in Tunisian dinar and only in Tunisian dinar. So the first and second bullet points are pretty straightforward. Any government can do this. It's the third and fourth where we start seeing countries losing monetary sovereignty. So number 3, it's a government that only issues debt denominated in the national currency. In other words, you only issue government bonds that are denominated in the national currency. In Tunisia, for example, we issue government bonds denominated in Tunisian dinars, but we also issue government bonds denominated in dollars and euros and Japanese yen and other currencies. And that's the part where a country starts to lose its monetary sovereignty, because now you have an external debt denominated in a foreign currency that you don't have. And I'll emphasize this point later. And then fourth, it's a country that doesn't fix its exchange rate to the dollar or euro or any foreign currency, or to gold. So having a flexible exchange rate gives you full monetary sovereignty. And that's not an easy thing to achieve for developing countries that have a lot of external debt and are dependent on food imports and energy imports and other basic necessities like medical equipment and things like that. So it's number 3 and 4 that should be the focus of our attention in the next couple of days, because this is the structural issue that forces countries into a situation where they lose their monetary sovereignty. And this distinction, this basic definition, allows us to focus on the difference between a currency issuer, which is the national sovereign government, and the rest of us, users of the currency. Households, firms, any other entity outside of the government. And this approach is really the central focus of MMT, or modern monetary theory, which is the approach that's kind of behind this analysis. So once we understand the definition of monetary sovereignty, we realize that not all countries are equally sovereign when it comes to monetary sovereignty. So I'd like you to think of a spectrum of monetary sovereignty, where on one side of the spectrum you have countries who have full monetary sovereignty. They issue their currency, they tax in the same currency, they have a national debt only denominated in their currency, and they don't fix their exchange rate. So the good examples would be the case of the United States, the case of Japan, the case of Canada, Australia, the UK, and so on. These are countries that enjoy full monetary sovereignty. The other extreme end of the spectrum are countries who completely lost or giving up their monetary sovereignty. The case of Ecuador, for example, where a country completely dollarized and stopped using a national currency. The case of the CFA countries who essentially use a foreign currency since colonial times to this day. But most developing countries are somewhere in between on the spectrum. And the position of the country on that spectrum will depend on the level of external debt that the country has relative to its economy. It depends on, how desperately the country needs to fix its exchange rate or manage its exchange rate close to a particular margin. And I'll emphasize this point. So our focus will be on countries that have weaker levels of monetary sovereignty in the next few days in this conference. And I'll use Tunisia as an example today just because I grew up in this country and I know a lot about it. So the key implications for monetary sovereignty are the following. So what I want to talk about here is for countries that have full monetary sovereignty, and the goal, as I will explain in a minute, is we want to reach this level of full monetary sovereignty and full independence. But the key implications that, number one, government budget is not the same thing as a household budget. This is something that the economics profession has created so much damage in, popularizing this idea that, individual household finances should translate the same logic and the same even moral principles to the national government budget. So one thing MMT makes very clear is that households have to follow sound financial principles. So you and I have to work, earn an income, then spend it. We can spend beyond our income if we borrow. But once we borrow, we have a serious financial burden that we have to pay off at some point, which means you have to either reduce your spending at some point in the future or increase your income somehow in the future. But it becomes a real financial stressor on a family's budget. The government, on the other hand, the government is the only legal sovereign issuer of the currency. So the logic of government spending is that the government spends money into existence first so that the rest of us in the economy can have access to it. So spending comes first, then taxing comes from the money that's already in circulation. So the logic is very different, which means a deficit for the government is not the same thing as a deficit for a household budget. A deficit for the government means that the government put more money into the economy than what it's taking out. And we'll talk about the implications of this in a minute, which means that government spending is not constrained by tax revenues, because as a matter of logic, government spending comes before tax revenues or tax receipts. Government deficit is essentially the exact equivalent to the surplus accumulated by the non-government sector. So whatever the government puts into the economy that it doesn't take out in terms of taxes, that's money remaining in circulation in the private sector, in the non-government sector. So this is an extremely important concept for us to realize that when the government tries to balance its budget and follows austerity policies and even tries to run a surplus, the equivalent of that would be a destruction of net financial assets from the private sector. And that's a very important distinction in the MMT framework. So spending for the government is not constrained by tax revenues, but it doesn't mean it's unlimited. So nobody in the MMT framework says that the government can just spend unlimited amounts of money. So what is the real limit from an MMT perspective on government spending? It's the inflationary potential. So we have to always have the government spend with an eye towards the potential risk of inflation. And the risk of inflation is determined by the productive capacity in the economy It's determined also by market power for some key players who happen to be price setters. And in the case of developing countries, in many cases, market power and corruption overlap quite a bit. So these are the three things that you want to pay attention to when you're spending. What is the inflationary potential of additional government spending? I'll give you a quick example. Today in the Tunisian economy, in any developing economy, you can spend the equivalent of, say, $100 million, and it will have an inflationary repercussion. But you can also spend the same $100 million in the same economy in a different sector of the economy without having any inflationary implication. A good example would be spending $100 million today to install solar panels in Tunisia. You're paying workers and technicians $100 million in total for their wages, for their work. What are they going to do with $100 million? There's going to be an increase in food consumption, there's going to be an increase in transportation, an increase in spending on entertainment, on whatever people want to spend their money on. So you look at all these industries that will experience an increase in demand. And if you realize one of those industries has a shortage of productive capacity, that's where you're going to see inflation. But you can spend the same $100 million on employing, a smaller number of people in the solar industry, and then dedicate some of the rest of the spending to increasing productive capacity in the food production area, for example, or the transportation production area, so that you're increasing demand, but at the same time you're also increasing productive capacity in anticipation of more demand in those areas. So MMT is very clear about not all spending is equally inflationary. So always spend with an eye towards the risk of inflation and target the spending in that area so that you're increasing productive capacity. And then use taxation and regulation not to fund government programs, but use taxation to reduce market power, use regulation to reduce corruption, to reduce market power, to target the price setters in key industries. So that's a very different perspective than the usual mainstream economics perspective that assumes by definition that any government spending is going to be equally inflationary. So what can a monetary sovereign government do with full monetary sovereignty? Number one is decoupling the spending from the taxing. In other words, unlike a regular household, where we usually think of earning an income first so that we can pay for our expenditure, the government can completely separate the taxing and the spending functions. Both are important, but they're not necessarily linked in the way we usually think of them. So spend on national priorities. If national priorities are health or infrastructure or education or renewable energy, set the national priorities and spend accordingly. And then tax pollution, not because we need money from polluters to fund health programs. Tax speculation in financial markets, not because we need money from banks to fund education. Tax extreme wealth, not because we need money or permission from the wealthy to fund national priorities, but tax in order to reduce pollution, in order to reduce speculation, in order to reduce extreme inequality, in order to reduce the power and influence of the oligarchs in the political system, to protect democracy from oligarchy. So these are important functions for taxation, but they're not necessarily for the purpose of funding a particular national program. So decoupling the two functions is an important strategic thing for any democracy. So tax to reduce excessive wealth, abusive market power, regulate markets so that we can pre-distribute wealth. Because we usually think of taxation as a form of redistribution. So we have this engine in the economy that produces pollution, produces inequality, produces socioeconomic exclusion, and we allow it to function this way, and we even try to accelerate it so that we have more economic growth. And then we say, oh, it's producing a lot of inequality, so let's tax the wealthy and redistribute to the working class and the middle class. The MMT perspective is saying change the engine from the beginning. So regulate the system to produce the pre-distribution effect that you want to have as an outcome. as opposed to having a malfunctioning system and then saying at the end, oh, let's redistribute to compensate the losers from the system. So it's a very different strategy that we would like to achieve with full monetary sovereignty. So regulate markets to regulate and reduce excessive market power, price-setting behavior, and corruption, which will be extremely important in our case. These are the goals once we achieve full monetary sovereignty. And what I want to talk about next is that we don't have full monetary sovereignty. And what we want to do is zoom in on the root causes of the things that actually cause developing countries to lose monetary sovereignty or never have achieved monetary sovereignty since independence. So a brief recap of economic development, and this is, a vast, simplification of the history, but I think many of you from different parts of the world and experts in economic development will agree that the main trends are there. So post-colonial states usually engaged in state-led economic development in the 1950s and 60s. This kind of the Keynesian era was kind of still alive and well. Import substitution industrialization was a key strategy that most developing countries, Tunisia in particular, used in the 50s and 60s. Import substitution is the idea that, under a protectionist system back in the day, you could develop infant industries and drive the economic development process with industrialization that replaces what used to be imports and produce them locally under protectionist and subsidized system. That system didn't last very long, and it didn't necessarily work very well for most countries. That was followed in the 70s by export-led growth. In Tunisia in 1972, the government passed a law to open up the economy to the global system and to drive economic growth with exports. And I'll show you some of the data later. This was followed by the debt crisis of the 1980s, mid-1980s. Tunisia experienced, food riots related to the debt crisis in the 1985, 86. And this was a global phenomenon. It wasn't just Tunisia. Obviously, many developing countries ended up in that cycle. So what I want to emphasize here is, why did the import substitution industrialization not work for Tunisia and for most developing countries, but it worked for the Asian tigers, for example? Why did export-led growth not work for us, even though we still believe that this is the only way out? But it worked for some other countries. And this is kind of the focus of what I look at. And after the debt crisis, we were forced into a corner with the World Bank, with the IMF, to follow structural adjustment policies, the SAPs, the neoliberal reforms that we still live with to this day. So this is the trade balance for Tunisia, looking at this falling off the cliff in 1973, 74, right after Tunisia decided to go into export-led growth. So export-led growth was supposed to generate the foreign currency reserves to drive economic prosperity in Tunisia. And this picture is not unusual. We look at most developing countries. As soon as they open up to export-led growth, we go into a massive decline in the trade balance. And the flip side of this picture is the external debt. As soon as you start accelerating economic growth via exports, you start accumulating massive amounts of external debt. Right? So what's going on here? Why is it that the faster we try to export, the more external debt we end up accumulating? Well, because the industrialization process never really fully achieved its potential. Because you ended up in a system where you specialize in low value added manufacturing, which means you have to import all the intermediate goods. You have to import all the capital equipment. In other words, you import high value added content and you export low value added content. So the idea of specializing in trade worked exactly in the opposite direction for developing countries because they specialized in low value added manufacturing, cheap assembly line. In addition to that, most developing countries, especially countries that don't have a lot of energy resources, the faster you industrialize, the more electricity you have to produce, the more shipping and transportation you have to spend money on, which means you end up importing more oil, more fossil fuels to drive the economic development process. So you end up with more imports of intermediate goods, more imports of technology, more imports of energy, but you're exporting low value added content. So the faster you accelerate exports, the deeper the problem gets. And this is not a thing of the past. We're still living in this structure. So this is extremely important to identify the mechanics of the existing system. And if the mechanics is working in the wrong direction, there's a famous line from Einstein where he says, the very definition of insanity is when you keep doing this, the exact same thing over and over and over again and hoping for a different outcome. And this is insanity. So the mainstream model to address these weaknesses, you're familiar with this list, austerity. Debt restructuring is the only way to manage external debt. Privatization of state-owned enterprises, sell the electric company, sell the airports, sell the airlines. It brings a little bit of money, you spend it in 2 or 3 years, and then you're back to square one. You can't privatize the telecom every 5 years. Once you privatize it, it's gone. Right? So these are short-term Band-Aid solutions. Labor market flexibility, race to the bottom, deregulate the labor market to attract foreign investors looking for cheaper labor. Not realizing that foreign direct investment is not necessarily only looking for cheap labor. I mean, why do companies relocate from the United States and go to Canada? Not for their cheap labor or environmental deregulation. But the kind of labor we ended up specializing in is the kind that forces you to race to the bottom, right, as opposed to race to the top. Foreign direct investment, export-led growth, we talked about this a minute ago. It's the negative terms of trade, the idea that you specialize in low value added, so it's a constant trap. Financial liberalization. You end up artificially creating a financial structure that attracts speculators exclusively because you're deregulating financial markets, you're lowering taxes, you're artificially creating higher financial returns via central bank policy, and you ended up attracting investors who are interested in buying low and selling high as soon as possible. So you end up with hot money coming into the economy very quickly. The financial system will thrive for a little bit, and as soon as the returns are high enough for speculators to leave, they'll sell and leave, which means you have a stock market crash, you have a banking crisis, and you have a currency crisis because they're taking money out, and you've offered them no capital controls to attract them in the first place. So not a sustainable strategy for developing countries to attract the best speculators of the world. Tourism, and this is very important for us here in Tunisia, for developing countries. It's often viewed as the only thing that will allow the economy to thrive because you're bringing millions of tourists, they bring euros and dollars, and the central bank is obsessed with those euros and dollars because they need to pay the debt. The problem with tourism is that it looks like a solution, but it has a big problem hidden in it. Because when you bring in millions of tourists, you have to feed them, so you end up importing a lot of food when you don't have food sovereignty. When you bring a lot of tourists, you have to transport them, you have to heat and cool the buildings for them and the swimming pools, so you end up importing more fossil fuels, more energy for transportation and heating and cooling and shipping and so on. So the more tourism you have, the more imports you have. So you end up with the bigger problem in the trade balance. So we accelerate tourism, we accelerate exports, we accelerate the trade imbalance. And as a result, you accelerate the pressure on the exchange rate, you accelerate the external debt. So not a sustainable solution economically, but also environmentally. When you have water shortages, when you have lack of food sovereignty, this is not a sustainable solution. Remittances, export, all of your engineers and doctors to Europe and the rest of the world, and they'll send money back home. Not a sustainable solution. When you need human capital for economic development, it's not a good strategy to try to export all of your skilled labor and specialize even more in unskilled labor type of industries. And this is something that unfortunately, government after government finds so attractive this idea. Like even in Tunisia, during the presidential debate, the question came up, what will be your strategy to negotiate with the European Union? And one of the candidates on the stage, one of the 25 or 26 candidates, came up with a brilliant idea and said, this thing we have with Europe, they take all of our skilled labor. And I said, oh, this is interesting. He's really bringing something important here. And then he said, we need to be really tough in the negotiations and tell them for every skilled worker you take, we'll give you 5 unskilled. So we're not even close to addressing the brain drain. His solution is send more, right? Because that's the only way to, solve the problem. So it's a race to the bottom, unfortunately. It's more external debt. And as I said, it's the very definition of insanity to do all of these things repeatedly, regardless of the orientation of the administration. Left wing, right wing, Islamists, they all have the same solution. And then you end up with the same debt crisis. And you're told there's no alternative, right? And the IMF comes in and says, well, this time do it a little harder, a little better, maybe it will work, right? And, it's a trap. This time it worked. So, the structural issues that we're dealing with, high external debt related to trade deficits, the major root causes for most developing countries are 3 areas. Number 1 is energy deficits, importing fossil fuels. And this is actually true even for countries that are net exporters of oil, crude oil, because they too export crude oil, which is low value added content, and they import refined petrochemicals, or they import gasoline and kerosene, which is higher value added content. So the refining capacity is not even there. So even if you're oil rich, you're still trapped in this low value added content system. So you have energy deficits, food deficits, and then the deeper structural issue, which is across the board, low value added content of export because of the kind of industrialization that we ended up pursuing. So these trade deficits lead to currency devaluations. And if your currency becomes weaker, like we've experienced in Tunisia and Egypt and many parts of the world, a weaker currency means the next morning when you're trying to import wheat, when you're trying to import gasoline, when you're trying to import medicine, all of those imports will be relatively more expensive in real terms, which means you're going to have food riots on the streets because people can't afford these more expensive products, which means the government has to step in and artificially subsidize those items or engage in more external debt to continue to finance the structure. And this is not a one-year episode. This is a constant every year episode for the last several decades. And again, repeating the same thing over and over, hoping for a better outcome, is insanity. And what we're trying to argue in the next couple of days is we need to look for alternative solutions, and alternative solutions that are not band-aid solutions that just, address the symptoms of the problem, but we need to look at the structures of the problem. And if the roots of the problem are energy sovereignty, food sovereignty, low value added content type of industrialization, then our alternative policies have to target those areas. So the only way out is investment in renewable energy to reclaim or gain energy sovereignty, sustainable agriculture to regain food sovereignty, water and energy management conservation policy. So it's not just producing more, but being more effective and more efficient at using it. This obsession with free trade that we've been, brainwashed with for the last several decades is not necessarily the best way to pursue economic development. So looking at different models of trade. In here I have South-South trade policy. In other words, trade, we're told, is good because it enhances competition. And we're told that competition is good because it improves competitiveness, it improves customer service, it lowers prices, it brings new technology. So it's sold as a good thing for consumers, it's a good thing for the economy. And there's this whole idea that competition is always good. But competition amongst equal is good. Even in sports, if you watch a boxing game, we have heavyweight champions fighting heavyweight champions, and that's competition. And it's legal and fair, and people enjoy it as a form of entertainment. But even in sports, we don't allow a heavyweight boxing champion to play a lightweight boxing champion. We say this is competition. It's illegal. It's unethical. It's ugly. Nobody would watch it. And yet, when it comes to trade, we allow that to happen. We take heavyweight countries, industrialized countries, and have them essentially destroy the competition in smaller developing economies. And we say that it's fair, it's competition, it's trade, it's healthy for you, right? So we're talking about competition amongst equal, and one way to do this is to form regional trading areas with equally competitive, but especially complementary economies, complementary in terms of capacities, in terms of resources, and that's one way to benefit from trade. And then absolutely necessary focus on value-added driven industrial policy. And one way to do this, and I've written about this, the idea of the job guarantee, where you focus on employment-led growth, so that the spending and the job creation that you're putting in place is targeting those structural areas, and have a true industrial policy, a true agricultural policy, a true renewable energy policy that allow you to build from within, mobilize domestic resources as much as possible. We're not saying close your economy to international trade. We're not saying end tourism. We're not saying, end your openness to the rest of the world, but be more selective, be more strategic, and focus on the structural weaknesses. It's not going to be easy economically. It's not going to be easy geopolitically. But if you don't have the vision for an alternative model, then we've lost already from day one. The first step is to have an alternative vision and pursue those goals, and then leverage your resources as much as possible to achieve those goals. What about inflation? This is a huge concern for developing countries, and I think the MMT perspective gives us a better lens for understanding the inflationary pressure that most developing countries struggle with. When you have a food deficit, when you have energy deficits, you're importing inflation, because the depreciation of your exchange rate from the trade imbalance is what forces you into higher energy prices and higher food prices. Low value-added industrialization is part of the problem, because that's the component that also drives down the value of your currency. So everything you import, you're importing at an international price, and you have no control over that pricing mechanism. So always spend with an eye towards the inflationary pressure, and if the inflationary pressure in your case is coming from housing, then you target inflation in that way, not the usual inflation targeting that central banks do. Central banks, what do? They raise interest rates, they lower interest rates. What does that have to do with housing? What does that have to do with healthcare? It's not targeted enough. So when we talk about true inflation targeting, the way I think about inflation targeting, it's not exclusively the job of the central bank. It's a job of the Ministry of Agriculture. It's a job of the Ministry of Energy. It's a job of the Ministry of Housing. It's all of these areas where you identify the pressure points, and that becomes your inflation policy. Is partly managed by the Ministry of Agriculture. It's partly managed by the Ministry of Education, right? To specialize in higher value-added content, you need investment in education, vocational training, technical skills. That has nothing to do with the central bank. The central bank can set interest rates all year long, and it will not change anything in the structure of the economy, right? So all of these artificial manipulations of central bank policy are extremely ineffective and weak ways of addressing inflation. But somehow we're told that's the only way to manage inflation, is give it to the central bankers, they know what to do, right? In terms of market power, it's the price setters who set prices. And central banks can raise interest rates, lower interest rates. If you're a powerful price setter, you're going to be a powerful price setter. And in cases of countries that rely on imports of basic necessities like food, energy, medical equipment, you typically have the government providing licenses for key importers that have exclusive power to be the only company or the only individual who is legally allowed to import gasoline, who is legally allowed to import bananas, who is legally allowed to import medicine. And once you have that market power licensed by the government, in many cases through corruption mechanisms, then if global prices go up or the currency depreciates, you raise prices, but then things calm down internationally, but you don't see any incentive to lower prices. So you take advantage of higher prices constantly. And that's not, that has to end. You can't have a corrupt price setting mechanism taking advantage of people who want to buy bread just because they can. Right? So corruption, capital controls has to be part of the equation. You can't exit this trap without using the leverage of the government in the area of capital controls. So what I want to end with is 3 practical solutions, not the only solutions, but 3 practical solutions that I've been advocating for a while, and I'm hoping to inspire some of you to think outside the box and think about a different way to exit this trap. And the 3 examples that I present will focus on sustainable food production, sustainable housing, and cultural heritage preservation. So, aquaponics, which is not a new technology invented at MIT. It's an ancient technique, thousands of years old, of producing sustainable food, organic food, in the most water-efficient system. You're essentially saving 90% of water compared to traditional agriculture. And with climate change, with the kinds of droughts that we're experiencing all over the world, this has to be part of the equation. When you have a technique that's so accessible and so affordable and extremely efficient, not using it is also, I think, a definition of insanity. So what is aquaponics? Aquaponics farming is a very simple technique of growing edible fish in the same ecosystem as leafy greens, lettuce, tomatoes, anything, and I'll show you some examples. It's a very simple technology that many companies today are actually taking to a high-tech level, and I'll show you a few examples. But the simple technique is the following. The fish produces organic waste. The organic waste decomposes naturally with bacteria that develops in the system and produces fertilizers. So you use a pump that pumps the water into a grow bed, and the leafy greens will absorb all the nutrients, all the fertilizers, and then will return, with gravity, will return clean water to the fish. So you're recycling the water over and over again, and that's how you save 90% of water use. The additional advantage of this is that you don't have to use any fertile land to grow vegetables. Those leafy greens are grown into clay pebbles because you don't need any nutrients from the soil. All the nutrients are provided from the fish waste. So it's 100% organic. You can't put any pesticides or chemicals in it because you kill the bacteria, you kill the fish, you kill the whole thing. So you're producing 100% organic leafy greens, and you're producing protein. You're producing fish for human consumption. And you don't need any soil. So you can place this in the middle of the city. You can place this in the most rural areas with no fertile land and no access to sufficient quantities of water, which means you can decentralize food sovereignty in every region. And you can do it on a small scale for one household. You can do it on a village scale, on a neighborhood scale, and you can do it on a national scale. And this is really where some companies are really investing in scaling this up and turning it into a high-tech system where you use high-tech sensors to monitor the quality of the water, the temperature, the humidity, the level of nutrients. So the level of research and development involved in this is really taking us into the future. But you can also use it in a low-tech model where you do a small scale and you do what I tried to do when I started learning about this system. So the technology is there. It's accessible. It's within reach. But do we have the vision and a commitment to reclaim food sovereignty by using many of the indigenous techniques that we have all over the world that are more sustainable, more effective, economically, ecologically, on all levels, instead of the current, ag business model that we have. So this is I tried to experiment with this, and I'm not a farmer. I don't have any experience. I wanted to see how accessible this. So this is my fish tank, and you can use worms also to break down the waste. And you can grow lettuce, mint, anything that's leafy green Within few weeks, it grows out of control because it's extremely productive. I didn't expect that to grow through the roof. In the middle of the winter, you can produce organic tomatoes, and that's the tilapia fish. Very edible. Or on a larger scale. So this company is called Superior Fresh, LLC, in Wisconsin. This is the largest aquaponics farm that I know of. It just started a few years ago. Massive industrial scale, 100% organic, producing salmon and producing leafy greens of all kinds. So we can scale this up at the region. We don't have to start with 100% food sovereignty next month, but let's start experimenting on a smaller scale. Let's involve universities in research and development, because this is the kind of interdisciplinary work where you need an expert in biology, an expert in solar energy because you want to use solar pumps. There's plenty of potential for engineering and research and development to improve the quality of the agricultural product that you're bringing in. This is another company based in New York. They specialize in microgreens, which is higher value added, I guess, for fancy restaurants that like those things. There's plenty of these in Australia and Singapore and other parts of the world. And again, not a technology that was invented by Americans or by the British or by Western civilization. This is from the global South. And now it's a technology of the West. This is just one example. This example here, I'm sorry, the screen is cut off. This is in Tunisia. This is Hajj Blayoun in Qirwan, fi Tunis, in Tunisia. Sorry, I'm switching languages now. Sustainable housing. Low energy consumption housing with local materials and modernized to meet modern day requirements. These are just a small group of activists, housing sustainability activists who are really trying to rediscover our native architecture and bring it to the modern era. The advantage of using adobe houses or super adobe houses is that it requires very little amount of energy for heating and cooling because it uses geothermal ventilation. Again, not a technology invented by MIT. Geothermal technology existed for thousands of years and all over the world. We just were told to give it up because it's too native, and we're told to import air conditioners and bricks and cement because that's more modern, right? But there are groups now rediscovering these techniques and modernizing these techniques and to produce the quality of life that everybody deserves. So there are solutions. We just don't have enough of a leadership and vision to scale these and bring these techniques from indigenous culture to the 21st century. We're not saying we have to go back to the caves and go back to farming, with low value added. And no, these are techniques that, to me, this is what development is. Development is not destroying the old and bringing, the new. It's taking what we already have, what we already know, and making it better, making it more effective and more efficient. And this is what some of these groups are doing. This is Tatooine, by the way, those of you who are visiting, not Planet Tatooine from Star Wars. This is the actual Tatooine. This is not a movie. This is Tunisian civilization. So this is not new, not invented by architects in Chicago or whatever. So, just stopped here, I think. So imagine the possibilities of jobs to reclaim food sovereignty, jobs to reclaim energy sovereignty. This froze for some reason. Jobs to revive local cultural heritage. With every elderly person passing away, we lose part of our history, we lose part of our knowledge, part of our language. So think of jobs in kind of digitizing indigenous oral history and indigenous culture. Think of jobs to preserve languages. And many native indigenous communities are losing their language and losing their culture, and that's a loss to all humanity, not just to countries. Jobs focusing on regional ecotourism, and this is high value added tourism. So imagine developing sustainable housing of the kind that I showed, creating bed and breakfast structures of sustainable housing, low energy consumption, with aquaponics farming and aquaponics bed and breakfast restaurants, with sustainable architecture, building local cultural heritage museums. And all of a sudden you have an ecosystem, an economic ecosystem that attracts a different kind of tourist. A tourist who's not coming for the nightclubs and the beaches and the swimming pools, the low value added, unsustainable kind of tourism, but a tourist who's willing to pay a premium to eat healthier food, to discover local indigenous culture, to stay at a bed and breakfast that is sustainable ecologically, and to know that you're contributing to a different path towards economic development. Now imagine scaling this up and that becomes the norm of tourism as opposed to the current norm. So we're not saying end all tourism, but bring a different kind of tourism, a high value added, more sustainable kind of tourism. Research and development, as I said, in new indigenous knowledge and technologies to upgrade indigenous knowledge and bring it to the 21st century as opposed to destroy it and erase it and then replace it with imported technology where you end up constantly trapped in that system that I described. So these are just a few possibilities. And all of these things, because of the decentralized nature of everything that I described here, you're actually reactivating or activating participatory democracy in a most decentralized way. And you're also exiting from underneath the power structure of the oligarchy. In some cases, you're exiting from underneath the power structure of the price setters, of the key players who control the food market, who control imports, who control energy imports in particular. You're creating a new economic structure that's by definition more participatory, more democratic, more decentralized, and more sustainable economically, culturally, and ecologically.